So what I'm going to talk about, because I'm assuming that the background for why we should be looking at economies beyond the growth era has already been set out for you by previous speakers, is to look at some of the insights that you can get into economies that are no longer growing and maybe even shrinking by using some very elementary systems modeling. So that's what I decided to focus my remarks on. And it really divides up into three separate but related stories that will unfold as I proceed through my slides. The idea of using systems modeling to understand the way the economic system works, certainly at the global level, I think can be traced back to this book by J. Forrester in 1971. That's not actually what the cover looked like, but that's what you can download from the internet these days. I will try to find the original cover one of these days. But that book isn't very well known. It came out a year before the much more well-known Limits to Growth. But the books are very similar, and a lot of the graphs that appear in Limits to Growth, in fact, also were in World Dynamics. But Limits to Growth, as I'm sure you know if you didn't read it at the time, some of you are far too young for that, has, I think, made a lasting impact, even though it was heavily criticized when it came out, I think often inappropriately. The idea of Limits to Growth, I think, was planted but very much by this book, and it used systems modeling to make its case. Then 20 years later, the same authors revisited their earlier work, and whereas in 1972 they were sounding a warning, if you like, that if we continued along the trajectories that they had identified, we would go beyond the limits. Well, when they looked at it in 1992, they entitled their book Beyond the Limits, that we hadn't heeded their warning, and there we were now looking at what happens when the human economy worldwide, and of course there's lots of differences in different parts of the world, but looking at this globally, what happens when we transgress planetary boundaries. And then they took another look in 2004, came back to their earlier title, but it was a 30-year update, and sadly the story continues to unfold in a way that I don't think is very encouraging. Well, the approach that they used for understanding the world system can be described very simply by this kind of diagram, which shows the population, and that could be, by the way, a population of things that we make, like a population of cars, just as much as a population of people, but in this example, think of people, and it shows that the stock of people, shown by that rectangle, goes up as you have more people who are born, more births, but the number of births itself is determined by the relationship between population and the fertility rate. And you can see the plus sign shows that's a positive reinforcement cycle with positive feedback. But we also have negative feedback. And here we have deaths detracting from the population being determined by the size of the population and the death rate. So this is a very simple systems model of a population. And you can make it increasingly complicated. For example, I'm not going to do this now, but you could have the fertility rates and the death rates themselves being determined by the size of the population. And it quickly gets to a point where unless you're very, very smart, and a lot smarter than I am, unless you simulate this on a computer, you really can't say how the system will behave. Well, I decided to use this kind of approach to understand how a national economy functions. And I built an economic model along lines influenced by that earlier work, which I called low growth, and I set out to answer a specific question. And the question that I hope you can see up on the screen says, can we have full employment, no poverty, fiscal balance, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions without relying on economic growth? Well, let me quickly describe to you the structure of the model so that you have some understanding of what lies behind the simulation results that I'm going to show you in a moment. There you should see macro demand. That's the standard definition of gross domestic product, by the way, for those of you who aren't economists, it's simply the sum of all the money that is spent in a nation on consumption, the goods and services we buy, on investment, which means new equipment and buildings, government expenditure on goods and services, on exports, which are part of a country's gross domestic product, minus imports, because those are produced abroad. That gives you GDP. All of that is represented in the model. At the same time, we have the capacity of the economy to produce all of these things. And the simplest way of representing that, and I followed quite a conventional approach in economics, is to say that what we produce depends upon our capital stock, that's our equipment, infrastructure, on our labor force, which is L there, and T, which is time, which stands in for all of the things that change through time, such as technology and other elements that affect productivity. So the way the model works is that it makes a projection of how much money is going to be spent, looks at the capacity of the economy to produce it, and then estimates what will the employment level be and the utilization of productive capacity in order to meet that macro demand, given what we know about macro supply. Now we find very easily why we are into this sort of growth cycle. One of those elements in macro demand, investment, adds to the stock of capital. And so the capacity of the economy to produce grows each year if we continue to expand its capacity. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we have to spend more money to ensure a reasonable level of employment, but in doing so we expand the size of the economy, its capacity to produce, so the next year we have to spend even more money to keep the system functioning in a reasonable way. And it's sort of coping with that dependency on growth that's a big challenge for us for the environmental reasons that I'm sure we're all well aware of now. So all that's represented in the model, as is population, which can increase demand, but it can also add to the labor force, and so again stimulating expenditure, stimulating capacity to produce. The model keeps track of the fiscal position of all governments combined. In Canada we have 3 significant levels of government: provincial, federal and municipal, so it's all added up into one story within this model. The model also keeps track of the number of people living below the poverty line in Canada, and that's becomes something that you can change through intervening in the model in various ways. And it estimates greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a forestry sub-model as well. So that's the structure of the model. Now it's all online. If you go online, you don't see that. What you see is this. You see sub-models for each of those components. There's consumption, investment, government expenditure, foreign trade, all of the main components of GDP. You'll see there the production function, that's that bit that I showed you at the bottom of the diagram before, and all the other things, the capacity utilization, employment, capital, population. So you can see it gets quite complicated. There's a component for redistributing income, keeping track of government income, and on it goes. And the reason why I use a model to understand all of these things is because when you link all these things together, you can't work out in your own mind, I don't think, what the story is. And that's really what the simulation model does for you. So now let me show you what happens when this model is run such that the 30-year period from 2005 to 2035 is assumed to be very similar to what it was like in the 30 years prior to 2005. And what you see there, I hope, because I'm not seeing what your screen is showing, I'm only seeing mine at this end, but what you should be seeing is GDP per capita rising steadily. That's what it did in the previous 30 years. This model doesn't deal with the short-term bumps, ups and downs. It's the long-term trend that it tracks. It shows greenhouse gas emissions rising steadily, which of course is something we really want to avoid. It shows unemployment, which is the blue line, not doing very much. It shows the government's debt to GDP ratio, which is its fiscal picture, if you like, steadily improving. And it shows, and I think this is rather sad with all that economic growth, that the poverty line, the brown line there, steadily rising. Now that poverty line is the Human Poverty Index from the UN. It consists of a low-income measure, it consists of adult illiteracy, and the third one is longevity beyond the age of 60, a health measure. And you can see what it says is that if we have another 30 years of economic growth of the sort we've had in the past, there'll be more poor Canadians at the end of 2035 than at 2005, largely because there are more Canadians, but the percentage of poor Canadians doesn't decline even with all that growth. Well, that's the business as usual case. What I then did was to say, well, what happens if we took all of the growth out of this economy, all of those factors there you can see on the screen, and I said, well, I'll phase them out over a 10-year period, starting in 2010. By 2020, the economy has now been shocked so that the forces of growth are no longer there, and you'll see that it's quite a disaster. It's true that GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, levels off at the end of the period, and greenhouse gas emissions have come down a little bit, but unemployment goes off the top of the graph, poverty gets incredibly high, the government's fiscal position has got completely untenable. This is a disaster and something I think that's quite frightening and to be avoided. Can we do better? Well, here's an alternative scenario where again I've introduced some changes from the year 210 to 220, and you can see that the rate of growth of the GDP per capita is slowing down and in fact levels off for the last 5 or 7 years of this scenario. Greenhouse gas emissions have come way down, unemployment is lower than it's been for 50 years in Canada, the human poverty index would be lower than anywhere in the world, and still the government's fiscal house is in order. So it's possible to generate scenarios that look quite attractive. It's not, of course, that easy to implement them in practice. And there's a huge amount of work to be done to work out how to do that. But here are a few of the major steps. The first thing is we have to limit the use we make of materials and energy and the generation of waste and land use. I'm not going to go into the reasons for that, but that I think is fundamental for bringing our economies back into some kind of balance with the biosphere. Within this scenario that you're looking at, population has been stabilized and the labor force has been stabilized. There are policy measures that are available to bring those results about. There's also a carbon price that's included in this scenario, and that's the main driver to bring greenhouse gas emissions down. But if we had a carbon price, it would make all prices more informative. All the things that are carbon intensive in their production and consumption would appear that way to their prospective buyers who would buy less of them, and that's a good thing. The unemployment rate has come down a lot in this scenario because it assumes that the time spent at work on average in Canada would decline by about 15% over that time period. We'd still be working longer hours on a yearly basis than some European countries are right now. So this is a drastic reduction in work time, but a significant one nonetheless. And the human poverty index has been brought down through the implementation of more generous anti-poverty programs, which are included in the model and factored into the financial position of the government. So there's a range of measures there that we would have to be looking at to make that kind of scenario happen. Well, now let me push on to a more demanding task, and that was to generate a degrowth scenario for Canada. The one I've just shown you would have Canadians living something like 50% higher in material standard of living by 2035, but not continuing to grow. For this conference I attended last year in Barcelona, I used my model to look at a degrowth scenario for Canada. And this is how I went about generating the target for degrowth. Because you can't just say, well, let's degrow. You have to say, to what extent? I continue to work with GDP because it's the main measure of economic activity we have, but not necessarily an ideal one. And I said, well, what would a sustainable global GDP look like? And then work from there to what should Canada's GDP be if we have degrown to a position where we could say we're now taking a fair share of the world's resources. So in 1980, the ecological footprint just about equaled the biocapacity of the planet. So I picked the GDP of that year as an initial indication of what a sustainable global GDP might look like. But since the ecological footprint consists of a lot of carbon, and I think we've got some means of getting rid of carbon, I said, well, if we got rid of 40% of the carbon emissions by 2035, then we could have a global GDP more like the one we had in 1999. So I upgraded the global GDP to about 30.5 trillion. To bring it to a GDP per capita, you have to divide by population. I picked 8 billion for 2035. Could be higher, could be lower. But that gives us a sustainable average GDP per person worldwide. So now for a Canadian sustainable GDP per capita, I said, well, we could just pick that. It would represent something like a tenfold reduction in average GDP per person in Canada in a 30-year period. Even I, in my most optimistic days, think that's completely out of the question. So I picked a higher number. I picked a degrowth target where Canadians would be living on average 4 times higher than the average sustainable GDP per capita by 2035. That turns out to be where we were in 1976. And I would think these numbers would be rather comparable for Britain too. A standard of living that you were experiencing in about 1976 is what we're talking about here. And then I simulated this for Canada. I said, well, could we get down to that level of GDP per capita and still meet some other important objectives? So there you see a Canadian degrowth scenario where Canada's GDP per capita has been brought down to that level, 4 times the average that the world might be able to sustain. Unemployment has come down. It's a bit choppy, but it does get down to about 4%, which is low in Canada. Greenhouse gas emissions have come way down. That's very easy with a shrinking economy and a carbon tax. The human poverty index is way down. And still the government's debt to GDP ratio is very low. And that's partly because in this scenario, the revenues from the carbon tax are providing a great deal of income to the government. The point of this is showing that it's still possible to have a coherent macroeconomy which isn't growing, which is in fact smaller than it is today, and yet other important objectives such as low unemployment and low poverty and a fiscal balance are still being met. But I've got no illusion about the challenge of trying to get there. Let me show you some of the differences between these 3 scenarios. We've got the business as usual scenario, the blue one. That's the 30 years into the future, much like the past. The low no-growth scenario, the second one I showed you, which is the red line. And then the yellow one, which is the degrowth scenario. And you can see the vast difference in GDP per capita as between the degrowth scenario and the other 2 scenarios. Greenhouse gas emissions, vast differences there too. It's true that the low no-growth scenario gets emissions down somewhat, 20% over that 30-year period, but the degrowth scenario is the clear winner. The business as usual scenario is a disaster scenario in my mind. There are 4 graphs here. The top left-hand one shows you the different assumptions about population. Population growth is stalled in the second 2 scenarios. On the top right-hand side, government expenditure continues to grow, but much more slowly in the low no-growth scenario. Of course, it grows considerably in the business-as-usual scenario, but it has to shrink in the degrowth scenario. That's a problem, of course, because it means cutting back on all sorts of things that governments provide, and I didn't go into detail about what that might be. Then you see the work time scenario, how that has changed from one scenario to the next. A small reduction in average work time for the low no-growth scenario, but a very substantial reduction in work time for the degrowth scenario. And that's just to reconcile an increase in productivity of labor with a shrinking economy. The only way to do that without having a lot of unemployment is for everybody on average to work less. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, you see the different assumptions about the carbon tax. No carbon tax is business as usual, a significant carbon tax in the low no-growth scenario, and a very major carbon tax and rising in the degrowth scenario. Well, the last part of my presentation, I'll try not to take up too much more of your time, is to tell you a little story about this character who wrote this book, who met this character, who I expect is well known to you, Tim Jackson at the University of Surrey, who wrote this book, and we met in a cafe in High Street, Holborn, to discuss a number of things, but one was the productivity trap. By the productivity trap, we mean this issue that if an economy is not growing, and yet we are becoming more productive, the only way to avoid unemployment is to work less, and you saw that clearly illustrated in the degrowth scenario. But the extent of working less can be quite dramatic, and we're not at all sure that necessarily people want to do that and will be willing to do that, or it's even the right thing to do, because there's obviously value in work itself. So we began to question whether our assumptions about ever increasing labor productivity really make sense in a green economy. And what we did was to divide the economy up into three sectors. The conventional sector, which is shown in the middle of that systems diagram there, or at the top. The green infrastructure sector, which you can think of as the sector which has to make the windmills, all the renewable energy equipment, enhance sewage treatment, all of that stuff which makes an economy greener. And then on the right-hand side, at the top right-hand side, you have the green services sector, which is all of the employment in making houses more efficient, but it also, in our work here, includes the human services sector to make sure that people are adequately cared for, something that's really important with an aging population. Then also in the model is the labor force, the level of employment. You combine productivity and employment assumptions, you get the rate of economic growth, and out of that comes carbon emissions. So that's the basic structure of this model. Let me show you three scenarios. I know there's a lot of stuff there at the top for you to look at, but the important thing is to see that in all of these scenarios we assume the same unemployment rate. This is 5.6%, could be any rate, but we picked a fairly high rate for some reason I can't quite remember. Green infrastructure employment grows at 5% a year. So that sector, and this is based upon real data for the UK, grows at 5.5% a year, but the overall labour force doesn't grow at all, and the green services employment sector doesn't grow. Hours work doesn't change. We do have some increase in labour productivity in the conventional sector, in the green infrastructure sector, but not in the green services sector. And the argument there is that those are very labour intensive, and the opportunity for improvements in labour productivity when you're providing human services, or even when you're insulating houses one by one, are very limited. So that's why there's no increase in labour productivity there. And then we have the fact that when you invest in green infrastructure or in green services, it can reduce carbon emissions. And we make some assumptions about that. Well, what I've now displayed is the result of those assumptions. You can see GDP continues to rise, but the composition is changing dramatically. The green component of GDP, made up of that combination of employment in the infrastructure and services sector, rises dramatically, but the green conventional sector also rises. Greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions come down, but they don't come down to the 20% level that we were shooting for by 2050, which is the target for the UK. So then now I'm going to change in the next scenario one of those assumptions, and this is the assumption on hours worked. And so, well, suppose we reduce the amount of hours worked. If we keep all the other assumptions the same, it will mean a more slowly growing economy. In fact, as you see from the graph, total GDP declines a little bit. This is a tiny little bit of degrowth that you're seeing there. The conventional sector, however, shrinks much more significantly in the economy overall, because again, the green sector is increasing its share. And with that change in assumption of hours worked, we do manage to bring the greenhouse gas emissions down to about 30% of where, well, I forget what the base year is. It was not 2008, it's some earlier year, but not down to the level of 20 that we were shooting for. So the third scenario does give us that. Here we get a very significant increase in the number of people working in green services. And we also get a slight decline in labour productivity in that sector. And here you see, again, GDP slightly declines over that period. The green GDP increases massively. Conventional GDP changes downwards a lot, and we meet the carbon reduction target. So what all this is to say is that taking account of changes in labour productivity and the impact that the green sectors can have on greenhouse gas emissions throughout the economy, you can generate scenarios which still maintain a high level of employment without the overall economy increasing in size, but the composition of the economy changing dramatically. So the conclusions we reached about the poverty trap is that there are some very significant implications for investment. We should perhaps pay much less attention to trying to raise labour productivity through investment, because as we do that, we put more pressure on ourselves to reduce employment in order to be consistent with the steady state economy, or something like the steady state economy. That investment in a more positive way should be designed to put more emphasis on resource productivity, on renewable energy. Well, you can see the list there. All sorts of things that would make the economy more in balance with the biosphere in which it's embedded. There'd also be some changes in capital productivity, and we're not quite sure, and we're working on this now, how the financial system, whether it could adjust to these kinds of changes. We may have to look at different returns on investment for different kinds of investment and wonder about how to make that possible. So there's lots more work that always comes out of what you think you've done needs to be pursued. But I guess our conclusion is that the productivity trap isn't a fundamental one, and like a lot of these other concerns, if we're smart about it, we can escape the productivity trap. So I'm going to close with just a list of changes that I would like to see and anticipate as describing our economies if we are successful in moving beyond growth in a thoughtful and deliberate way. You can read these for yourselves, but I would look for, and as many other writers do, more emphasis on quality, less on quantity, more durable and repairable products and less disposable ones, more leisure, less work. I think that comes out of all of the scenarios I've put before you. I think if we're not relying on economic growth to solve the problem of poverty, which of course it's been very poor at doing, then we need to intervene in other ways to develop a society that's more equitable and less unfair. There are so many dimensions in which we should be more inclusive and less exclusive. That comes with a more equitable society, but I would also extend that to things like concern for other species, and not simply regarding nature as a storehouse of resources for human exploitation, but as in some degrees companions with which we share the planet. We need to be looking much further into the future than our institutions today and ourselves individually typically do. I'm rather disturbed that it's become quite commonplace for politicians to focus very much on the next election and companies to concentrate on the returns of the next quarter. This is not the kind of outlook that will see us through the sorts of transitions that we have to make. It's trite to say it, but not only do I think more local and less global is a desirable direction to go in, I think it's a direction we will find ourselves going in as energy prices continue their upward march. That will have an effect on trade, it'll have an effect on travel, it'll have an effect on agriculture and so on, and I think that would actually be quite salutary. At the same time, I think our economies will and should become more diversified and less specialized. I don't yet see much of a change in that direction, although one can find examples of that. If we do all this, I do believe that we'll all become more resilient and less vulnerable to shocks which quite clearly now happen in one country and are transmitted to other economies almost instantaneously. And I think that we've overstressed, through the kinds of institutions we have, the impulses we all have to compete, but at the cost of emphasizing the impulses that we also have to cooperate, and I would expect to see in the future more cooperation and less competition. Now, a lot of this is a wish list, but I thought I would put it before you because in being invited to address you, I was asked to consider what life beyond growth might look like, and so I have made a stab at it for you. And I think that's where I'll bring my remarks to a close and invite any questions and comments that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for this very insightful presentation. And we are now taking around 10 minutes of Q&A.
Put my hearing aid on.
Oh, 1 second, you need the mic.
These sorts of recommendations are things that you hear quite a lot of if you're on the ecological future and limits to growth sort of circuit. But I hear less of how you can bring about the political change that needs to happen when the incumbent sort of power systems and corporations are doing everything they can to fight against the factors you list are pretty much in your last slide are pretty much all negatives if you happen to be in command of a large chunk of the world's economy through the power of a corporation or something like that. I mean, it may not be very clear. But how can you change when the powers are on the other side of the equation?
Well, if you believe that you can't bring about change, then it's most unlikely to happen. And it's not likely to happen in a way that you might want it to happen. So I don't take quite as extreme view as you have. Of course, power is very unequally distributed in our society, and a lot of the things that I think make good sense are likely to be opposed by people who would see their interests challenged. But change does happen. It's not, we don't, so the way I try to see the world, and the way I think it's appropriate to see the world, is it's a place of continual change. And that what we have to do is to insert ourselves in these processes of change to try to make the change its direction. And we do have examples, many examples, of abrupt changes that nobody saw coming. And yet when you look back, as the pundits often do, they'll tell you, oh, but you could see the seeds for change were there. We just didn't realize things were going to happen that fast. I mean, what I've just said obviously applies to some of the events right now in the Middle East, which very few pundits were seeing were going to happen even 3 months ago. The same with things like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, those are extreme examples. So here's I guess what I'm trying to do, and that is I do think that pressures are building that will oblige change of one kind or another, and that the more we can prepare ourselves by thinking about good opportunities for change, or changes which we would welcome, the more likely I think that when change comes, it will take the forms, not exactly as I've laid out, of course, but along these lines, because we will have done something to lay the groundwork for them. But, you're really, in a way, asking the wrong kind of person to tell you how to bring about change. If I have any strengths, it's in doing some of this background analytical work to point out that alternatives are there, they are real, we can choose our future. But if you don't think that, if you think there is no alternative, the famous Tina complex, then I think that the subtitle of my book really takes on the meaning that I intended, which was slower by design, not disaster. The disaster scenario is out there waiting. All I can say is, you're having your meeting today. Presumably, I can't see how many of you are in the room, but it seems like a fairly healthy number. All of you are interested in these kinds of ideas. You'll all, those of you still at university, will graduate, go off into different walks of life. I mean, we are the vehicles of change. And some of you will end up in corporations and will try to make change from within. In my own career, I've worked in government on 2 separate occasions. And, government, once you're a government employee, does impose some constraints on you, but every day you're there, you have choices to make about whether you're going to speak up for the change that you think should be happening, and you can infuse it in some way in your briefing notes to ministers and so on, and provide alternatives, or you don't. You say, oh, well, the system doesn't allow it, and I'll hunker down. So I accept what you've said. We have a very, very challenging task ahead. But the point I would make is that we shouldn't say, oh, well, it can't be done. We have to say what can we do, both as individuals and as groups, to bring about these changes.
Hi, I don't know very much about the political landscape of Canada, so I was interested to know if there are moves, if there are parties which are championing these ideas of shorter working weeks, or making the divide between the richest and the poorest smaller, or carbon taxes. Is there a Green Party or anybody taking these up?
Right. Yes, in a partial way. In Canada, because of the structure here, a lot of the political power resides at the provincial level, not at the federal level. And so, for example, British Columbia has a carbon tax. Just introduced one on its own. Didn't have to get federal permission or anything like that. It has the authority to do it. Quebec has a small carbon tax as well. But there isn't one at the federal level. But what I've discovered over the last 2 or 3 years talking about these sorts of issues, if you'll allow generalization, is that the receptivity to these ideas is greater the more local the government is. So local governments are very aware of limits, very aware of budget constraints. They deal with poverty on a day-to-day basis, so they pay a lot of attention to their anti-poverty programs. They are more receptive to this kind of thinking than the more senior levels of government, which have different priorities. So, you know, we can point to elements. We have different political parties in power at the provincial level, so you get different emphasis given to different elements of what I've talked about. But I don't want to delude you at all, including myself. There is no major political party in the country which has a program that looks very much like what I outlined today, although I wasn't really outlining a political program explicitly, much more a sort of an economic program. But we, on the other hand, do have a Green Party. The Green Party captures about 7% of the vote across the country, and it's very much on side with these range of initiatives. But because we have the same electoral system that you do, 7% of the vote doesn't necessarily mean you get anything like 7% of the seats. And so far, no Green person, member of the Green Party, has won a seat at any of the provincial or federal legislatures. So it's a mixed story.
One more question for you.
My question's kind of related to the previous questions. It's also a political question, really. I think it seemed to me you were suggesting two specific policies here, the carbon tax and some kind of policy possibly on the maximum working week. And I really wanted to ask a question about the link between the modelling work. It seemed to me most of your presentation was about modelling, and then there was a bit of visioning on the last slide. And I'd like to ask how much of the visioning you were able to include in the modelling, because obviously the advantage of modelling, I mean the disadvantage of modelling is that you have to make a great many simplifying assumptions to get the maths to work, but the advantage of modelling is that it's very impressive to policymakers. So I kind of wanted to ask you, have you been to talk to those policymakers, and if so, what was the reception like?
Okay, well look, I think the advantage of modelling is more than it just appeals to policymakers. I think that we all work with models. We all have some notion of how we think the world works, and we take positions according to that. The advantage of these kinds of models is that you have to be explicit about your assumptions and about your data, and others can then comment and critique, and you can improve in that way. So I think there are real advantages to modelling beyond the PR kind of advantage that perhaps you were pointing to. Yeah, I've made many presentations to people in the policy world, both in Canada, the US, and in Europe, and Australia. I mean, lots of different places. And I guess that, look, there are two things. I mean, it doesn't necessarily come across very well in the presentation I gave you, but there are two key points I try to make. One is that in this day and age, unless you understand and conceive of the economy as embedded in the biosphere, you really can't get started on these issues. If you insist on thinking of the economy as some kind of freestanding system, maybe with a political dimension, but no physical links to the biosphere, then you will never grasp the predicament that we are faced with. And that is one described by an ever-increasing use of materials and energy, and an ever-increasing need to dispose of those materials and energy back into the biosphere, and clear evidence that we've put stresses and strains on the biosphere that can no longer be tolerated, at least to the advantage of our species. And I think that that's one very important message. The second important message is that we don't have to have economic growth. Certainly once you're a rich country, you don't have to have continued economic growth to meet all of the objectives that we thought economic growth would bring for us, would help us meet. The employment, the anti-poverty, the paying the way of the government. Those are the two things that I think are really important to come out of this. To the extent that it takes a while for those messages to get absorbed. It may take generations. It may take too long, in which case we're really in big trouble. On the other hand, I see plenty of evidence that these perspectives are getting picked up, and so I remain somewhat optimistic that eventually there can be some very positive political change coming about as a result of our changing understanding of the situation that we have to deal with.
I totally agree with you that modeling and framing of issues is fundamental. I would like to close here, and can you please join me in thanking Professor Victor for his contribution.